Let's just do this. I mean, this is a minimal cut, and it's not even a cut. But if that's all you have to do to avoid a catastrophe, then why not do it?
In today's video, Peter Schiff, founder, CEO and global strategist of Euro-Pacific Capital, gives a warning that the 2008 crisis was just the prelude to a larger sovereign debt crisis in the United States that may lead to a collapse of the US dollar.
Powell pointed out, he said that he felt that he had a special obligation, at the Fed to be transparent because he wanted trust. He wanted the country and the public to trust the Fed. And that's why it was so important that the Fed be transparent. And for the sake of transparency, that's why they're doing these press conferences now after every single FOMC meeting, so that they can be transparent, so that the public will trust them. Well, their transparency is just lying. That's all they do. They're actually very opaque, right? Because they're covering up what they're doing in a cloud of lies. So if you're going to redefine that as being transparent, I don't think they're transparent at all from the perspective of that they're not honest. They don't tell the truth. They're trying to misdirect people and blame the private sector for the problems that they have created. Powell also talked about forward guidance, praised forward guidance. I think Bernanke might have talked about that too, but being an effective tool. And I think the forward guidance was part of the problem, especially when Bernanke was Fed chair during the housing bubble. I think the fact that the Fed had told the markets that rates are going to go up a quarter point at a time, and they had, however many, 16, whatever, 17 rate hikes, quarter point every meeting, that created some certainty that rates would be low for a long period of time, and that's what helped fueled the housing bubble. The housing bubble was bigger than it otherwise would have been due to the transparency of the Fed. If the Fed was less transparent, if borrowers really were in the dark and they weren't sure how long rates would stay low and how quickly the Fed might raise them, they might have been a little bit more cautious with respect to their willingness to take on a lot of debt. But because they were pretty much assured of this steady, slow path, that's what, encouraged them to take on all this debt. And that's what caused credit standards to be lowered. And of course, the problems ensued. Now, here was a particular funny point. Powell was, trying to talk about, what the Fed has learned and how they're trying to evolve their understanding of inflation. And he said he's trying to figure out right now, he's still kind of in the dark, but he's trying to figure out how inflation moved from goods to services, right? He's not really sure how that transition happened. He understands the fact that there was a problem with goods because, the supply chain bottlenecks, but he's really not sure how it moved into services. Now, he kind of acknowledged that maybe the support that fiscal and monetary policy gave to consumers was part of the reason for the increase in good prices, which of course it was the reason, right? It's not part of the reason, but he still doesn't understand how that had anything to do with services, which is of course, well, the money to buy services also came from the government. A lot of services are bought with government money, right? A lot of services are purchased with borrowed money. So it's pretty obvious why we have an inflation problem. It's just obvious to everybody other than the current and former chairpersons of the FOMC. Anyway, let me move forward. I want to talk a little bit about Biden because he kind of threw down the gauntlet. He just gave a speech in, I think it was Japan, and he talked about the debt ceiling. And no, we are not raising this debt ceiling. We're not agreeing to these Republican demands to cut spending. We want to raise revenue. But I think it's interesting because he talks about how catastrophic the consequences will be if we default, which he claims we will do if we don't raise the debt ceiling. And all the Republicans are saying is, hey, let's roll back spending to where it was a few months ago, like 6 months ago. Let's just do this. I mean, this is a minimal cut, and it's not even a cut. But if that's all you have to do to avoid a catastrophe, then why not do it? That shows you how disingenuous Biden is being. And that's a nice word, to describe it. But again, if you take him at his word, it'll be economic Armageddon, a complete catastrophe. All hell's going to break loose if we don't raise the debt ceiling. And I'm not going to raise the debt ceiling because the Republicans want small cuts in government spending. Then Biden is saying that those small cuts in government spending are a bigger catastrophe than default, because he has a choice, right? I can choose these little tiny cuts in government spending or this massive catastrophe from a default. And if he chooses the catastrophe of default, either it's not that big a catastrophe and he's lying, or he thinks these tiny cuts in government spending, right, rolling back to where we were like at the beginning of the year, that is a bigger catastrophe than the one that he feels is in store for us if we don't raise the debt ceiling. And again, of course, all the government has to do is choose to prioritize interest on the debt, and then there's no default. The only way there's a default that is a consequence of failure to raise the debt ceiling is if the government decides not to pay the bills. It's got plenty of money to pay that interest. So why would it choose, right? When you have Biden talk about how it would be so horrible if we defaulted on our debt, then don't do it. Just use the money. So he's actually saying what's worse than not paying the interest on the debt is not paying some of these other bills that we're going to prioritize, because we're going to choose to default, even though we know that it's going to be complete disaster, which again shows you that's all lying. Why would they choose to do something that's a complete disaster when they don't have to? Well, because they're not going to choose to do it, right? So again, it's all this theater trying to get the Republicans to cave so that they won't make these little teeny cuts to government spending, and maybe they'll get some extra tax revenue. But I want to finish up, talk a little bit about politics, because a couple things have come out. First, didn't get a chance to talk much about that Durham report that came out that really, not only exonerates Trump when it comes to this whole Russia collusion nonsense, but what's more important to me is not that Trump was innocent, because I never felt he was guilty. But who is guilty is the media, the government, the FBI, right, for investigating it, because now we know, based on this Durham report, that there was no evidence to suggest that this was true. Yet they investigated these claims anyway, despite no evidence that there was anything that there was to investigate. In contrast to the decisions regarding Hillary Clinton, because they will acknowledge that there was far more evidence that Hillary Clinton did something wrong than Donald Trump. Yet why wasn't Clinton investigated? Because it didn't fit the political agenda. Trump, right, was investigated because of politics, because of what he was associated with. He was a bad guy because he was a Republican or a conservative, even though I don't even regard him as a conservative, but the left thinks he is, right? That's their definition of a conservative. And so he was a bad guy. And so therefore, the investigators either deliberately did this out of politics, or their judgment was just compromised. That because of their own personal perspective, that clouded their judgment. And so they assumed the worst out of Trump, because they just assume he's a bad guy because he's a conservative. And they gave Clinton the benefit of the doubt because, she's a good guy or gal, right? She's one of the good ones. She cares, right? She's a Democrat, so she's good. And so we'll cut her some slack, right? So it's a bias in the regulatory body. And of course, these are all bureaucrats. These are all government people. So they're going to be biased to like government because they work for government, right? So they want to see themselves as the good guys, working for this benevolent government. And so if somebody is critical of government, maybe a conservative libertarian, well, they're bad. And this is further reinforced by what's going on with this FBI whistleblowers hearings. If you've seen any of those, but you had these 3 guys that were fired for blowing the whistle which you're not supposed to. I mean, there's all these laws to protect whistleblowers, unless, of course, the person blowing the whistle is a conservative, blowing the whistle on some liberal. Well, then you've got no protection whatsoever. You're just a tattletale. We got to fire you, right, for tattling. But they're actually making it out like these whistleblowers are a bunch of traitors. And in fact, what they were doing was standing up for the rights of Americans. Because if you're working for the government and you think that some of your associates in your department at the FBI, if they are, violating the rights of other Americans because they're weaponizing their power, they're using their authority, the color of law, to go after and target people due to their politics, due to what they believe in. And this is the ultimate corruption of government, using government force to silence opposing political views.